355 days. That's how long the average adult spends sitting on a toilet in their lifetime. Well, if you can believe Google anyways. Today, I'm going to be transforming my toilet space. Yeah, okay, it's a pretty boring room and nobody really wants to watch a toilet makeover. But on the other hand, it's actually a really great space for you to have a go at a first DIY project because it's probably one of the smallest rooms in your home. I've previously done a bit of a toilet renovation on another house and I had a lot of people commenting to say, why is the toilet not in the bathroom? Well, here in Australia, it's actually quite common for the toilet not to be in the bathroom. Personally, I actually really quite like this setup because it means the toilet's separate, and if someone's a little bit stinky on the toilet, it means that the bathroom's still nice and clean and smelling fresh. If you've seen my front entry makeover, I'm actually going to be carrying through a little bit of a styling from the front entry here into this toilet space. I'm going to be adding the half panel up the wall with the timber trim on top and painting the top half of the wall. Now, to add a little bit more character in this small space, I'm either going to paint the top half with some sort of pattern that's going to look like a fake wallpaper, or I'm going to add picture frame molding to the top half of the wall as well as the shiplap panel on the bottom half. The tiles are obviously going to be staying. They're quite a nice pattern tile and there's no way I'm going to rip up perfectly good tiles just for the sake of them. So let's jump into this makeover and start transforming this toilet space. The first thing that I'm doing here is removing the door off the hinges. Now, typically, if you were doing this as your makeover, you wouldn't have to remove the door off the hinges. I'm just doing it for one, because it's going to be easier to install the paneling without the door being here. But for two, because I'm filming the process, it's going to be a lot easier to see what I'm doing without the door being in the way. So I've just unscrewed it from the bolts and the hinge, and then I can move the door out of the way. Because I'm not painting these arcs, I am actually just going to leave those hinges sitting there, and then I can easily just screw the door back in place when I'm finished. Sometimes when you're trying to remove screws and you don't have very good access, like I did here with these hinges as I was trying to remove the screws from this side of the door was getting in the way a lot of that. So it can be really helpful to have a really long attachment that you can put on your drill, because if you've got a long head on the drill, it's a lot easier for you to then be able to remove those screws. There's really not a lot of things that I need to remove in this toilet. It was literally just take the door off, and then the only other thing I have in here is this pretty boring basic builder grade toilet paper roll holder. So to get these off, I just need to undo the screw underneath, and then I'll be able to pull that off the wall, pull the fitting out, and then unscrew that from the wall as well. So I'll just take the toilet roll off. Once again, having this long attachment is going to make the process a lot easier. Depending on who installed the toilet roll holder, you may find that there's some anchors in the wall. It really just depends whether they've used anchors to attach that to the wall or not. Now that I've removed that, if I was just going to be painting the walls, I would need to fill these holes. But because I'm actually going to be installing a panel straight over the top of that, I don't need to do anything with those holes. I also think I'm probably going to be getting a nice new toilet roll holder, so I'm not going to be reinstalling the one that I had. I'm probably going to get a nice new one. Today's video is sponsored by Who Gives a Crap, and they have given me the inspiration to transform the toilet space into similar colors as their bamboo toilet rolls. These toilet rolls are 100% bamboo, and they're so sustainable and environmentally friendly. The best part is they get delivered straight to your door, so there's no more instances where you're going to run out of toilet paper and you're having that emergency situation where you're running around the house or looking for the last roll. I've grabbed out the first panel and now I need to measure it to size. The reason that I'm doing this is because you'll be able to see in the hallway that I've got the paneling already on the wall. Now in the hallway I have a skirting board underneath, but in the toilet I have a strip of tiles that the builder's laid, and so in order to get it at the same height, I'm going to need to measure the height from the floor to the top of the panel and then cut this panel down to size. It would look really silly if the hallway didn't match in with the toilet and that they were at different heights. So all I'm going to do here is just get some measurements and make sure that I've got the right height of this panel, and then I'm going to go and use the circular saw to cut it down to size. Now, it's a really hot day today where I'm working, and there's lots of flies around because they're all in my garage workshop trying to escape the heat. So if you hear flies buzzing around, it's just because it's a very hot day and they're wanting to be here in the shade with me. So now I've got my panel and I know that I need to cut 40 mil off the panel. What I'm going to do is set it up, clamp it down, and then get ready to cut this down to size. I've now got these all set up, ready to cut. So I'm using just another piece of timber as a guide rail, and then I'm placing my circular saw down so that you can see here that the 0 lines up directly with the line that I'm wanting to cut. You need to make sure your measurements are correct and double check all of those measurements before you make any cuts, because it can be very hard to then fix it if you cut it too short. If anything, you want to cut it a bit too big because you can easily cut a little bit extra off, but once you've cut too much off, you can't then add it back on again. For the first panel, all I needed to do was cut the height down so that it was the right size, and then I installed it with the nail gun onto the wall. The second cut, I'm going to need to do both the height and also the width, because this is not going to be a full panel. So what I do is I start off getting my guide rails set up, and then I'm going to cut it down to height first. And then once I've got the height correct, I'm going to take the panel back in and get the measurements correct for the width. A quick tip for when you're cutting the width is to make sure you have your blade on the correct side of the line that you've just drawn, because otherwise you may end up cutting the width of the blade too short or too long. As I mentioned, I always cut mine a little bit too long, and so this time I actually had to cut it down a few extra times to get the right size. Here we go, third time lucky. I ended up having to reset up my circular saw and cut a mil off of the circular saw because the sander just wasn't cutting it. What I mean by that is initially I cut it a little bit too long and I thought I would just be able to sand off the excess, but the sander was going to take too long to sand off the amount that I needed to sand off to get the right size, so I just reused the circular saw instead. But as always, I would much rather have to go back and make a couple of extra cuts to get it the right size than cut it too short in the first place, because then there's nothing I can do to fix it. Now I'm just working my way through and installing the paneling on the other side of the toilet. So it's basically going to be exactly the same. I'm going to have one full panel and then I'm going to have a second panel that I need to cut down to size. Thankfully, I was actually able to use the other half of the first panel that I cut down for the second part of the other side of the wall, which just meant I was able to use one less panel. Now, before you install any paneling to the wall, you do want to go through and check that there's no wires in the wall, and you can use a detector to be able to just go along the wall and check this. In this room, there's not a lot of power because it is just a toilet, so all I did have was this one light switch, but the power actually runs down from the ceiling in my home, so there was nothing coming up from the floor, which meant that the bottom half of the wall had no power in it at all, and I was safe to put the nails through into the wall. I just used the 30mm straight brad nails, but you could also use liquid nails if you wanted to. So now that I've got my design and I've got my measurements, I take measurements of the entire wall up and down, and then I start to work out the spacing. So work out the thickness of the timber that I've got in between. So for me, my timber was 31 mil. So I need to make sure I allow enough space for the actual timber. I then also need to take into account anything else in the wall. So I have a power point here in the wall, and I needed to make sure that I come out further than the power point before I started my first frame. So what I did here was take 13 centimeters or 130 mil off, and that's going to be my spacer. I want to have the same spacer between all of the gaps. So I've gone with 130 mil and I've started to space them out. So what I then did is I go, okay, if I want 3 spaces, I'm going to end up with 4 gaps. I'm going to have those 4 gaps here, and they're all going to be 130 mil. Each of those is then going to have a 31 mil piece of timber on the side. So I've written the 31 mil piece of timber. I was then able to work out what each of the distances of these pieces of timber is going to be. So I'm going to have 350.5 mil, and that's going to be the piece of timber that I'm going to cut, which is the bottom piece, and I'm going to cut them with a 45-degree angle on the end. And then running up the same, I did the exact same thing. So I worked out the total length of the wall. I then worked out my 130 mil space, my 31 mil for the individual pieces of timber, and then what I was going to have for the two different sizes for the panels. So really what you want to do is get all your measurements correct before you start cutting anything. Like I said, I find the best way to do this is to space it out on a piece of paper and create your design. The other option you can do is use masking tape, and then you can mark it out on the wall. If you're still not sure what it is that you want to do, or what shapes or what sizes you want, you can then mark it out on the wall with masking tape so you can get a bit more of a visual feel for it. I'm fairly happy with my design based on the picture that I've drawn, so now I'm going to go and start cutting these pieces of timber. Now that I've got all of my measurements done, it's just time to cut them. So I'm going to be using my drop saw to do the cuts, and as I said before, I'm going to be cutting them all on 45-degree angles so that we can join them together like picture frames. So what I've done is I've checked all of the measurements so that I know what the longest part of the length is, and then I can join them all together like those picture frames and create all of that effect on the wall. So I'm going to be grabbing out the individual pieces, cutting them down, and then measuring them to cut them on each end. Now, don't mind me where I just moved my plant out of the way so that I can get a nice straight line with this piece of timber. Now, my mic's gone flat for the day, but before I finish, I did just want to quickly just say what I did to make it a little bit easier for myself was just use one as a measurement for the other one. So I cut one down to size, and then I used that as a guide to cut the rest. So I didn't have to individually measure out each one. Then once I was done, I did just check each one to make sure the measurements were correct and whether I needed to take any off. But I wanted to make sure that each one was perfect, but it was easier and faster for me to use one as a guide than to individually measure each piece. Because I'm going to be having this piece of timber along here as a trim, I needed to put the trim on so that I could then get my spacing correct. I'm not actually going to be installing this trim yet. I just sat that there with a couple of nails which I can pull out afterwards so that I can paint the wall and then install the trim. But I wanted to just make sure the distance between the top of the trim and the bottom of the box was going to be perfect, and it's just easier to measure out with that already sitting there. I then used my spacer that I cut to start installing the boxes onto the walls. So I held the spacer in place, and then I installed one strip, and then I did the side strip with the same spacer and worked my way around each of the boxes, making sure to put a couple of nails in there to hold it while I get the spacing correct. And then once I had the spacing correct, I was able to go back and add in a few more nails to make sure it was nice and strong on the wall. So I got one side of the room done and that first wall in my first day, and now it's a new day and I'm just going to go along and cut all of the pieces for the other side of the wall. So these lengths are going to be the exact same size as the other side of the room. So I just cut the first one down to size and then used that as the guide for the rest of them. And then once I had all of them cut, I then just came back in and installed them all on the wall. Once again, using the same spacer as I used on the other side to make my measurements all of the same and that both sides of the room were going to look universal. And then I just went through with my nail gun and installed all of the picture frame molding. It's so interesting to get everyone's different opinions on the molding and what their personal preference was. I mean, I love how it looks and I feel like it gives a little bit more character to the home. When I moved out here, I moved from another home that had been previously built in the 70s, and it just had so much more feeling and character in the home. And this home was a brand new build, but it had been built in what I would call a really basic builder grade way, and it just didn't have the same emotional feelings for me. And now what I'm doing is going through room by room and adding a little bit more emotion into the space, so it's got that really custom feel and it makes it feel like it's uniquely my own home.
So I'd be really interested to know at the end of this video what your opinion is on this picture frame molding and whether you think it adds an extra feel to the space or whether it's, as some people described, a bit of a dust catcher. Now, I wasn't originally planning on putting one of these picture frames up above the window, but when I stepped back and looked at the space, I felt like it was missing something there, and so I decided that I needed to put a frame up there as well to really balance out the whole room. I just made sure that I kept the same spacing from the ceiling down to the top of the picture frame, but then I didn't need to do the same spacing between the window and the bottom because otherwise it wouldn't fit very well. Now, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist and I like things to be perfect, I went through and I caulked all of the edges where the frame met the wall. You don't need to do this, and if you find that your picture frame molding is sitting quite close to the wall, you might not need to do this, but I really wanted to keep those gaps so that they were flush with the wall, and when I painted it all, it looked like they were there originally, so I went through and I did all of the caulking around the edges. I then also had to go through and fill in all of the nail holes once I finished all of the caulking. So when I did the caulking, I just went along with the silicone gun and then went with my finger along and smoothed that out perfectly smooth so that I got a really nice flush finish. And then when I went through with the wood filler, I also used my finger just to push the wood filler into all of those little gaps and the nail holes. You can either use a wood filler because this is a wood framing, or you can also use a multi-purpose filler. When I was using the multi-purpose filler on the top, I actually found it did work a little bit better. So I actually ended up using the multi-filler with the spatula on all the bottom half and then also on some of the framing.
I'm almost ready to paint the walls. I've just got one last thing to do before I can put the paintbrush to the walls. So I just need to go through, I've filled in all of the holes. I went through and I filled in all of the gaps in between where the frames meet, and then also all of the little nail holes. I just need to go along with some sandpaper and sand off all of the excess wood filler. Then I need to give the walls a little bit of a wipe down in between to make sure that there's no dust on the walls that's going to stick to my paint, and then I'm good to go.
So when I mentioned before that I preferred the multi-filler to the wood filler, I was actually referring to this section where I was doing the sanding. I found that the multi-filler sanded off just a little bit easier and it didn't require quite as much elbow grit as the wood filler. It was just because when I applied the wood filler, it was a bit of a thicker consistency and a bit hard to remove all of the excess before I then left the excess there to sand off. Whereas when I was using the multi-filler, I was able to pretty much get it flush, and then I only needed to do a really light sand. It's time to get started painting. So I'm going to be using the same dark color paint that I used on the other side of the hallway. So you'll be able to see here in this frame where I was on the outside of the door frame that the black is on the wall. It's the same color that I'm going to be painting on the inside of the wall just to keep it all uniform. But I'm also not sure 100% that I'm going to love the dark effect in this space. It is a reasonably small space, and so having it all dark may make it feel even smaller, and if I decide that once I've painted it all dark, I need to add a little bit of a light color in, I'm not against just painting one of the walls, probably the back wall where the toilet is, a lighter color just to break up all of the dark color. I've painted quite a lot of the rest of my home in this same dark color, and I really love it because there's so much natural light in those spaces. This space is a little bit closed off and only has this one window of natural light, and that's why I'm contemplating whether it may be a little bit too dark, but we'll wait and see what it looks like at the end. Because I had so many intricate details that I was painting around in all of this space, I just used a mini roller and a paintbrush. So I'd cut in up against the roof and the cornice all with the paintbrush, and then I would also use the paintbrush to paint all of the wood frame, and then I would just use the mini roller to roll all of the flat surfaces in between and around the outside of the wooden framing. Once I finished painting all of the first coat of the black on top of the wall, I then needed to paint the white on the bottom half of the wall. Thankfully, these panels are pre-primed panels, which means that they have had a primer put on them before I even purchased them and installed them. And that meant I was able to just use my white top coat. I'm using a water-based enamel paint for the bottom half of these walls because they are going to be a heavy traffic area with young kids bumping into the walls regularly, and this is my kids' toilet. Also because with whites, if you use the oil-based enamel, it is definitely going to yellow over time. There's nothing that you can do that's going to stop an oil-based enamel just yellowing with exposure to the elements. So if you want to paint white and you want it to be quite heavy duty, I would recommend that water-based enamel. If you're not worried about it being so heavy duty, you can just use a standard latex paint. I let the paint dry, which thankfully didn't take too long on my beautiful hot summer's day, so I gave it 2 hours in between the coats, and then I came back and painted the second coat on this wall. So once again, just going through and using the paintbrush to paint all of the timber, and then using the mini roller to roll around that. I painted a second and a third coat of the white on the bottom half of the wall. Because it is white, I wanted to make sure I had a really good coverage. Sometimes when you're painting white, if you only paint 2 coats, you're not going to get that full coverage. And sometimes even with 3 coats, you're not going to get a good coverage. It really depends on the primer that's being used. So you may need 4 or even 5 coats. Now that I've finished all the painting on the wall, I can go along and properly install my timber rail. So I'm going to be leaving this as raw exposed timber and just putting a clear coat of stain over the top of it. So what I did is attach it to the wall with the nail gun. I then went along with a wood filler, which is a hardwood filler. So it's the same color as the actual Tasmanian oak timber. And then that way, when I sand off the excess, you're not going to be able to see all of those holes that have been filled. Now this toilet has very little storage, and I didn't want to just put the toilet rolls on the windowsill. So what I'm going to be doing is installing a shelf above where the toilet cistern is. I had a piece of Merbau that was an offcut that fit perfectly in this space. So I just grabbed some L hooks that I could then use. I measured the space to make sure the toilet rolls would fit between the shelf and under the window frame. And then I was able to put anchors into the wall that I could use to attach the shelf to the wall. The most important thing here was to make sure the shelf was level, so I just used a little level to get that right before I screwed it into the wall. The last thing that I needed to do in this space was install the new toilet roll holder. Now when I shared this on Instagram, I think this was people's favorite part of the entire makeover, and I had so many people asking questions about this toilet roll holder, so I'll link it down in the description along with all of the other products that I used for this makeover in case you're wondering the details about where I got it from. But once I had the toilet roll holder installed, I then just went along and sanded off all of the excess of the wood filler before putting on my clear coat of varnish to this strip of timber. I used a gloss only because I really wanted to highlight this piece of timber, because this is going to create that little bit of warmth in the space and create a separation between the timber panels on the bottom and then also the dark paint on the top. I installed a hanging shelf to give a little bit more personality to the space, and then put all my fancy new toilet rolls on my custom built shelf. I love that these toilet rolls act as home decor, and if you want to get some fancy toilet rolls for yourself, I'll put my link down in the description, and you can even get a special discount using my code. Now let's take a quick look back at where we started and then see how the toilet looks now. Now it's an extremely luxury toilet, but I absolutely love how it turned out. I think that the picture frame molding gives this space some much needed atmosphere. The shelf gives the toilet rolls a special space to go, and then my toilet roll holder gives the space a little bit of glam. So what do you think of my fun toilet makeover? Do you like the picture molding? Are you now inspired to give your toilet a glam makeover? If you missed my last video, I did a front entry makeover where I did a very similar styling to this, adding the paneling on the bottom half of the wall and painting the top half of the room black, but it really transformed the space, and I'm sure you would love that video too. Click the link on the screen now to go and check it out for yourself.